Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help motivate, educate, and inspire others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the awesome Tim Toterhi from America. I'm hoping that I've pronounced that right. I think I've already made my first slip up, but hopefully our listeners and viewers who are also tuning in on YouTube have not noticed that too much. And I'm now a little bit embarrassed. I'm going to head straight on into my introduction for the amazing Tim. Tim is not your usual HR guy. He's passionate about slashing bureaucracy and rethinking old thinking. He is a TEDx speaker as well as a ICF certified executive coach. The author of several books, including The HR's Guide to Getting and Crushing Your Dream Job and The Introvert's Guide to Job Hunting. Tim is also a project management professional, or PMP, and CHRO with over 2 decades of management experience across the board in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. He craves practical solutions and tangible results. His goal is fewer forms and more function. Learn, teach, rinse, and repeat. Welcome to the show today, Tim.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
No worries. I'm so sorry for all of our listeners if I've just pronounced Tim's last name incorrectly. To start off with, Tim, tell me how that is pronounced and also where the name came from, because I think it's got quite an interesting story to it, hasn't it?
Sure, yeah. So it's Toterhi, and it came from an Ellis Island mistake. So when my grandfather's father came over from Italy, they just changed the letter plate a little bit of boggle with it and added a couple of letters, subtracted some others, and now I have this wild last name, which is actually interesting because the only Tim Toterhi on the planet. So that does help with Google searches.
I love
That's one positive.
Tim Toterhi, I love that. And where are you calling in from today, Tim? Whereabouts in the States?
So I am in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Raleigh in North Carolina. Awesome.
Which I'm still working on my Southern accent. So I grew up in New York. So this is a trick for me. I still get on the phone with my brothers. I still sound like a soprano, but for now, I'm working on the Southern accent.
I love it. I love it. Oh God, I love the Americans. My fiance is American. He's from Idaho, from a potato farming region of the Northwest. And so I'm so fascinated by all things American and all the different regions and everything like that. So that is amazing. So tell me, Tim, and for all of our listeners who are tuning in on Apple or the podcast apps and also YouTube as well today, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to recently.
So it goes back a little bit. I mean, I had an interesting career gateway into HR. I wasn't always in HR. I actually started in sales management, and did sales support. And then I actually got into HR through selling training products. So when I look back at the career arc, it sort of makes sense now on paper, but it was a little bit wacky way to get into human resources. And over the years, I had a variety of different jobs at various size companies, from huge global companies to startups, and did a variety of different things. I was in talent management, learning and development, organization design, and then actually went back out of HR into a project management role where I ran a PMO, which got me back into the business a bit, which then led to a role where I was doing a lot of M&A work and doing diligence and integration post-acquisition. So that was broadened the experience as well, which ultimately led me to this job now, where I head up HR for a company called Cenduit, which is a leading e-clinical technology provider that really works in the healthcare space. So it's that sweet spot between healthcare and technology, which gives a really cool blend of big company feel and being able to be nimble at the same time. So it's quite an interesting ride and a fun role.
Awesome. And I think, from my experience interviewing people for a living, I guess in a day job being, formally kind of headhunting and working with lots of different global organizations, actually a lot of the best HR professionals I've come across are those who've got a really strong commercial bent, and obviously you've worked for some unbelievably, brilliant global organizations, like your Bayer, like Quintiles, and these big organizations through to some of your small startups. And you've obviously had the commercial sales experience in the early days. I think that is excellent. I mean, do you feel that has really kind of shaped the way that you have ended up going throughout your career? And do you think it's kind of helped having that commercial side?
Oh, absolutely, because I think that HR actually isn't HR anymore. We've broadened the topic and the profession so much that there is elements of legal and finance and marketing and communications or social media now. It really isn't what it used to be. So being able to be flexible and nimble and consistently learn different parts of the business really helps you succeed. And you learn along the way, which is always nice.
Talk to me a little bit, if you don't mind, about kind of, about your career journey and actually making it obviously to where you're at right now. You're an accomplished author, you're an accomplished TED speaker, which I think is a brilliant accolade in and to itself, and quite an unusual path to follow, having worked for, all these companies, big and small. Talk to me a little bit about how you found yourself in this place. And I guess, have some of your early experiences as, a young professional kind of growing up throughout the various different, transitional phases of HR, as you've said, how that's affected now where you actually are today.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with just being able to have a broader perspective of things. So I believe that everybody starts in a location. You have your backstory to whatever your path is going to be. And one of the biggest things that you can do is try to consistently widen your lens and broaden your perspective on whatever you're given. And so for me, that becomes a view of either trying to see across the table to the other side of an issue when you're working with someone, or actually looking across the planet and actually taking the risk and the chances to chase opportunities when they avail themselves. So throughout my career, I've always been open to learning. I'm very much an introvert in that I like to assess first, listen, understand, and then speak. And I think that gives you a good opportunity to really learn from all of the awesome folks that you can try to surround yourself with, and then ultimately, make your move. So I've chosen that way to kind of approach things. And maybe it's a little bit cautious. It takes a little bit longer, but I think that thoughtful approach, ultimately lands you in the right direction.
And if you don't mind me saying this, because obviously I've listened to some of your awesome podcasts, Chris Rainey and others on the various podcast shows that you've been a guest on, you don't come across to me, if you don't mind me saying so, as a shy guy or as reserved in any way, shape, or form. Is that confidence something that has developed over time, or is that something that you've really had to work quite hard on? Because clearly you are living proof that it is possible for those that are maybe more shy or reserved or have been in their early career to actually really come out of their shell and then be on the TEDx stage.
So it's really interesting. I equate it to driving, learning how to drive a stick shift. So hills never look so big as when you're first trying to learn how to drive a manual car. But then over time, you just find yourself driving and you're, eating a sandwich at the same time you're driving. And it just becomes very much second nature. I think you always still have that concern. You're a little worried about things, but you do your preparation. And that's something I think that's really important for folks to get to. Everyone has shortcomings. Everyone has something that they're trying to improve. Sometimes you can bridge that gap as an individual, and other times you just have to come up with a workaround and something that you can get around your particular difficulty to make the success that you want. So I'll give you an example. I share this every once in a while on stage and so forth. But I'm dyslexic, so I see things, tend to mix up words, see things backwards, and so a teleprompter is actually my worst enemy. It's the hardest thing to do. I will never be your accountant, right? You don't want to hand me that. But what I can do is convey things in stories, or do some preparation and practice, and that kind of gets me around things. So which actually helps you with nervousness on stage because you really don't need the crutch of the teleprompter. You can work through that. So it's just a healthy workaround, and I think a lot of folks can develop those through the course of their career, just to get past any challenge.
It's funny that you say about your dyslexia. I too am dyslexic,
All right.
very, very visual, have to write everything down, otherwise I forget. They say my shelf is much smaller than other people's shelves, or at least that's what they said when I was at university, and I was like, oh God. But I was podcasting with a really lovely lady called Mamta Singhal this morning, really top engineer from STEM, and she came up with this term, dyslexiability, which she tells me has gone viral on Twitter or something like this, and people writing in going, oh, dyslexiability, I must tell my son, I must tell my daughter. That's what they are. Actually, dyslexic individuals and executives often are the most intelligent people there, because they've had to come up with, like you've said, using these various crutches and using these various different techniques to actually learn and then be able to excel in what you are doing. Really, it can make you, I suppose, in a way, even more resilient to want to achieve, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It breeds flexibility and just the ability to do things differently, to approach things consistently. So I always joke, I said, my license plate says persist, right? It's kind of one of those things where you just kind of consider, remind yourself to just try more and do things differently. So.
And so the young Tim then, just to scratch a little bit deeper, how did you overcome some of these obstacles as you were going throughout your career? Obviously, you've talked about kind of the TEDx talk in the public speaking and being able to get through those pieces. Were there any other pieces throughout your career that you found particularly challenging that you had to then kind of go away and find solutions for in order to overcome those hurdles? What with the dyslexia and what with the maybe being in a little bit more of an introvert than
Oh,
others?
yeah, I think so. I mean, the big thing for me was finding mentors. I have this phrase called standing in the middle, of always having a mentor and always being a mentor. And so throughout high school and college and into my 20s and 30s, I was a martial artist. And one of the great learnings that I had from that was being a leader is a lot like being a teacher. And the passion that you have for leadership comes not from being in front of the room, but being in the room and working with folks. And that just drives this ability to consistently learn and grow from everybody. And so you just kind of soak everything in. And it's interesting because a lot of folks will look at leadership and consider titles or consider what your role is or how many people you manage or what your budget is. I think all of that is nonsense. And one of the passionate things that I learned within the martial arts is we used to do belts off programs where you would invite people to come from different schools. And the one rule, and this was, I learned this from my first sensei, is that she would say, you can come in and study with us, but you leave your belt at the door. And so you would have to put it down and take off the top of your gi, and then you would go work out. So we'd have people from different styles and work. And what was interesting about that is you still knew who's who in the zoo. You still knew just by actions and what they did, what their rank was, but no one cared because you just learned from everybody. And I think that approach in work was hugely important to me because it got through any sort of challenge that I might have taking that same approach at work.
That's so awesome. I love that quote. So you still know who's who in the zoo, but you continue to learn from everyone, essentially.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other thing that when I take it back to work that's really important is from an HR perspective, there's a lot of things that we say almost habitually that we really need to just reframe. And I think being able to reframe problems is another big thing that we can get to. So for example, a lot of folks will be very familiar with the term, we're in a war for talent. People say that all the time. Well, I don't believe that. I don't think we're actually in a war for talent. I think we're in a space race. And when I talk about being in a space race, what I mean is that our whole goal as HR professionals, or even just as leaders, is to increase the velocity by which we achieve our goals within an organization and the velocity by which we help people develop through the organization. So if you can do those two things, you have this other side effect that really increases the gravity by which people are drawn to you. So one of the things that I find fascinating when there's an open role is I ask the hiring manager, who's drawn to work with you? And the big question becomes, do people look different in December than they do in January because they worked with you? And if you can do that, then it's super compelling. People want to work with you because, a lot of times people use that other cliche about, well, people join companies and leave managers. Yeah, that's true. But the reverse is also true where people will, follow managers from place to place because they're so good. I mean, that happened with me. I mean, I had a manager who took a chance on me a long time ago, and then he switched, companies and states, and I followed him. I never thought I would leave the block, and I followed him because he was, so good at what he did. And I said, if you can create those guys, wow, that you've got a really good company going on. So that's exciting.
Fantastic. I love that you're turning these quite traditional phrases on their heads. I think that's great. And you're so right. People do follow managers from place to place. They absolutely do. And I guess on that point, clearly leadership is about followers and about being able to influence and impact, hopefully in a very, very positive way. For you, what makes a good leader, and what are some of the experiences that you've had in the past where there's been particularly influential or particularly positive leaders that you think have really made an impact on your personal career and getting to where you are today?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that make a good leader, and we talked a bit about widening your lens and enhancing your perspective, but I think in conjunction with that, there's this view of actually being vulnerable and being open to being vulnerable associated with that. So I always laugh. I sometimes say, how dumb you sound depends on where on the planet you open your mouth when you're standing when you speak. So it's kind of interesting. And I was telling a story one time. It was in a place in Asia, and I was talking about the background and rough and growing up in the city and all that. And as I'm laughing, I said that the story that I was telling was nothing in comparison to what others went through. And I said, well, okay, I got to change the perspective there a little bit and make the relation based on story. So a lot of times I'll talk about. We may not have the specifics in common, but we have the generalities in common. So I might not know what it's like to go to high school in Shanghai, but we've all had that teacher that inspired us. We all had that person or the book or whatever that really got us to where we want to do. So I think it's broadening that. And then the reverse, if you can connect with individuals based on their backstory, then you can cross a cultural divide very easily, and that's helped work internationally. So that was eye-opening to not go in with any assumptions or any straight, I learned this from a book, so this is the way it must be, and being a little open to being vulnerable. So I think that's one. The ability to consistently root for others throughout their career is a big one. And then, a challenging one, I think, is really to not shrink from the tough issues. I think sometimes as a leader, there's something that comes up, and it's very tempting to be very political or safe in the way that you approach it. And whether that's a performance conversation that you have to have with somebody or tackling something that is put out into the world and you have a different opinion on, and you want to be able to share that. And I think being open is also a way to attack that.
And talk to me a little bit about, because you've touched on some of these pieces here that to me, very much centered within the kind of the diversity and inclusivity umbrella almost, which I guess to a degree, it relates to some of the pieces on, in both of your books, frankly, The Introvert's Guide to Job Hunting and also The HR's Guide to Getting and Crushing Your Dream Job. Because I know in there you're talking quite a lot about, being your true self, the authenticity pieces, got some really nice anecdotal stories and everything like that, which really do have a good, strong correlation to diversity and inclusivity in the more broad sense. Could you share with some of our listeners today and some of those who are tuning in a couple of little teasers about these two books that you've written and about some of the pieces there that I guess relate to being your authentic self and being vulnerable and really cheering on and, like you said, rooting for others, really? Some examples would be great.
Sure. I think I approach things because they're a challenge. So within the first book around being an introvert, it was that challenge of not being able to walk into an interview and just kind of snap and go with the flow and do that. And I wanted to give folks a view to say, actually, you have a lot of things that you can leverage. Chances are it's a three-part scenario where you've done your research on the job that you want, you prepared your materials and kind of have your paperwork, your CV sorted, and now you're going to the interview. But actually, all of the work that you've done to prep for that is going to make you shine. You just have to be open to unveiling your excellence in that situation. And here's how to do that. And so I gave them that guide. And the other book, it was more about specific scenarios that you were going to go into networking and how to turn networking from something that's very scary to something that is formulaic. And you can actually approach it from different helpful ways. So you could play reporter and find out about other people. You can help someone else and make a connection for them before you leave a conversation. So little things that were very practical about how to approach it from different ways, regardless of whether you're introvert, extrovert, or what background you have. Really trying to focus on that because I'm very passionate about finding talent that is good at the job. That's it. There should be no other characteristic. And, maybe it's a little naive, but I really try to drive into that passionate fairness of everything. And that's what prompted me to do the talk that I did called I Am Diversity, because I felt I was actually being left out of the equation. So when folks were talking about the topic, I'd sit there in HR meetings and, feel like, well, should I even be in the room? And when I went and submitted the application for the talk, it was sort of funny because the people were at TEDx were brilliant. They were so awesome. But there was one funny moment where they got the application, they called me up, and they hadn't looked at my LinkedIn file yet, and they go, "You're a white guy." And it was like we both just busted out laughing because it was like, well, yeah, and here's what I want to talk about, and they were just awesome with the whole conversation. But it led it down a different path on how we would approach the issue.
But I absolutely love that. And that was the brilliant thing about your talk is you're not necessarily expecting it. And I'm sure that there are people who are watching it thinking, what has this white guy got to say about diversity? But my take on diversity, and I know that you are the same from having obviously researched and watched a lot of your stuff prior to us meeting today, is that actually everyone has got a diversity story. They really, truly have. And diversity is very much about difference and, I suppose preventing that groupthink piece. The inclusion piece, of course, it's about embracing and including everyone. It's all it is saying that really, if we've got a bunch of people who all think the same, we're going to have no innovation there when it comes to thought leadership, to actually, driving home some really strong innovation. So actually diversity is applicable to all. And do you know what? You could be a white guy in a room full of Chinese girls, for example, and, really we need to have, say more diversity of mindset. Therefore, that might come in the form of a number of white guys. I mean, who knows? It's really such a broad piece, that for me, it's so important that, that we don't alienate the majority in the boardroom, because I've had, and I've walked into boardrooms countless times and I'll say diversity and inclusion. And I can kind of feel that, shoulders are slumping and people are thinking, oh God, we're going to get preached at. It's like, hello, no, it's not that at all. We've got to embrace everyone, because frankly there's no point in a lot of one specific community sitting in a room going, hey, there needs to be more, I don't know, Black people or Chinese people or whatever it might be here. You've got to talk to others. No point preaching to the converted.
Yeah, it's very important because I think if we simplify the diversity issue, we can get to this easy equation where, what people look on the outside equates to how they think on the inside. And that is tremendously problematic for what it could do for where we're trying to go, which is increase the diversity of thought. I mean, just practically, I was given a training session in Japan. And had I listened to all of the, general cultural, here's what you're supposed to do there. Well, I go and I actually talk to the folks. First of all, I'm laughing. I was like, I'm not training Japan. I'm training 10 guys who happen to be Japanese, right? And two of them had gone to NYU and, knew, knew more in New York than I did. And, it was really funny. So it's like, so we're talking about people. And this is really, I'm passionate about this because it affects me on the home life. So, my wife has a Hispanic background. But when you look, and if you were to ask, well, who's diverse in the family, quote unquote, who checks the boxes, it would be, her. But we look at our backgrounds, and they're totally different from how we grew up and had economic structures. And it's like, well, that's where I kind of came up. Um, the idea of we've seen each other's pictures, but we haven't seen each other's movies. And if we really want to be fair about diversity and what we're trying to get, we need to dig deeper. We need to spend that extra time to say, who we're all diverse, but how do we get to that fairness within the process? And that kind of dovetails to inclusion. I think when we talk about inclusion, it's a bit of a different animal than diversity. Sometimes we combine them, but I think inclusion maybe a little bit easier to define, but it only works when everybody's included. And I think that's where, sometimes we miss the plot when, we see all of these things. And before I say this, I think it's important to understand that you can be for something without being against something else. So I am for broadening the definition of inclusion. So I'd love to see more programs where they're open to everybody. I had asked, it's funny, I get asked to have a conversation with a group. I think it was called WIN. It was some inspired network, but women based. And I was laughing. I quickly realized that I wouldn't be a member, wasn't invited. And I was like, there's some irony here, guys. I said, why don't we just drop the W and say in, and everybody's included and everybody's inspired, and have that. So a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think we can do more to really ensure that everybody who needs some help and inspiration can be involved, and that would be cool.
This is very, very true. And whilst to your point, I think it's great that there's lots of different community bodies out there. And, like you, I've, done a number of talks or workshops at, recent one was at the WLA, Women Leaders Association, and, some other really cool things in the UK and, specifically up in Northern Power Women and everything like that, which is fabulous. But, making them exclusive to purely women alone, I do think is the wrong way to go. And, obviously, disclaimer here, these two organizations that I've mentioned, they both are very open and welcome to males as well, which I think is fantastic. But when you have it in the title, I think there is an element of the backtracking that then needs to happen where you go, oh, it's XXX Women's Network, but by the way, we're also open to guys as well. And, when we've actually just launched a new business, which I really wanted to talk to you about because I thought you would be a fabulous keynote speaker, actually. Business is called Dial Global. It stands for Diverse, Inclusive, Aspirational Leaders Global, because we're doing 3 global summits in New York, in London, and also in Beijing. We were very specific in keeping that name to be inclusive of all, so we didn't want to exclusively sound like in our brand and in our messaging that we were singling anyone out particularly, because I think really the inclusivity piece is almost more important than the diversity piece, really.
I agree with you because it's so important, because everybody, you're a fan of trying to drive this and have everybody succeed. I mean, to me, there's nothing better as a leader if somebody exceeds your expectations and goes beyond what you can do. So, that is probably the pride point or proof point of good leadership. But there is a little nuance with those names, because you feel like we've all had those invitations to parties where we weren't really like a secondary, characters. Like, hey, we're throwing a meat and cheese party. I realize you're a lactose intolerant vegetarian, but why don't you come along? It's like, come on, so it's a little funny, but anyway, it's all good fun. I think if we're each trying to, drive the health of organizations, that's the best thing, and that ultimately gets you where you need to be.
Completely agree. And just because I'm conscious of timings, and I know that you're a super busy man, let me just quickly, because there's another couple of questions I wanted to ask. So I'm going to call it, a mini little quick fire round for a few questions that I wanted to ask before I kind of go and summarize some of the really key learnings from today, of which there are many. I've got about 3 pages worth of notes here. But tell me, in a nutshell, I know we've touched on it already, but what does diversity and inclusion mean to you?
Diversity and inclusion means that everybody should be included, and that diversity is diversity of thought, and that if we combine those two things, we'll get the best of everybody. And that should be the goal, is trying to pull the best from everybody so that we all win together.
Brilliant. Big question. What does success mean to you, Tim?
I think is being able to leverage the three forces that get you where you want to be. And those for me are perspective, persistence, and creativity. If you can, and this is the challenge that people have as kids, if you can widen the view of folks so they can see past whatever limitations they have, that's great. If you can give them the encouragement so that they can consistently persist every day, and then creativity to drive workarounds, they'll be successful in wherever they want. And that's the goal for me.
Excellent. Any advice that you might have given to your younger self or to anyone else who is out there who is trying to make it in their career and would love to be in a position where one day they're a global HR leader, giving TED Talks, writing books?
It was sponsored in part by my daughter, but it's to have your frozen moment. And I think when you grow up with a tough circumstance, whatever that might be, you can carry around a lot of anger and doubt and negative self-talk. And if you let that go in that frozen
Let it
moment,
go.
you can run farther and faster than you ever thought you could. So do that quickly if you can.
And finally, are there any books or podcasts or inspirational pieces that you can leave with us today?
So I think my favorite quote, I'll leave you with that. It's by Jonathan Winters, who is a great comedian. And he said, "I couldn't wait for success, so I went ahead without it." And what that means to me is that, you'll really stress yourself out if you become obsessed with external scorecards like money in the bank or likes on a post or anything. But if you do your best work every day, then things ultimately will break your way, or not. And that's okay. But, when you try to wrestle serendipity into submission, you're going to end up pulling a muscle. So just do the work. Don't worry. Have fun. And it's kind of funny, a little bit cheesy, but I think this is something we all learned as kids. And I was reading this to my daughter the other day, but I learned it from Dr. Seuss in The Places You'll Go. And it's a little quote that he has, but it says, "You won't lag behind because you'll have the speed. You'll pass the whole gang and soon take the lead. Wherever you fly, you'll be the best of the best. Wherever you go, you'll top all the rest, except when you don't, because sometimes you won't." I'm sorry to say it's sad and it's true, but bang-ups and hang-ups can happen to you. And that's okay, because all of the failures that we have are part of our ultimate success story. So just go out and have fun. And if you do that, eventually you'll get where you want to be.
What a lovely quote to finish today on. And I love Dr. Seuss. God, there's nothing like Dr. Seuss. Everyone loves Dr. Seuss. So, in summary for today, and I really thank you so much, Tim. That's been so inspiring, and there's so many pearls of wisdom there. I'm just going to summarize a couple of them for all of our listeners who are listening or tuning in today. Thank you very, very much for listening to today's show. So some of the learnings I took away from today's session were really trying to drive yourself through those challenging times. Tim said himself, with the dyslexia, maybe things aren't always easy, but everyone has their shortcomings, and really pushing through those challenging times, you absolutely will come out the other side. If you don't do martial arts right now, I don't, but you're making me want to do martial arts. I really like that quote that you mentioned. You still know who's in the zoo, but you want to learn from everyone. So if you're applying that in a work situation, take that perspective, learn from everyone who is there around you. And it's not always the war for talent, but it's the space race, which I thought was pretty cool. We need to increase the velocity by which we can help further people and their development as well. I really like the piece as well about people following managers from place to place. So again, if you want to learn a little bit more about what makes a good manager, please do check out some of our show notes at the end of today's session. Oh my goodness, that's so typical. There is a car alarm going off outside, so sorry about that. Fortunately, it's just gone away now. And, also the diversity of thought piece. If you want to check out Tim's TED talk, he is the only Tim who has the name Toterhi. So now that's spelt Toterhi. So go away and Google him. If you Google him, he'll be the first one that comes up for his TED talk on diversity, and one of the only and first, TEDx talks I think actually that's been done with a white guy on diversity. And embrace that for all of our white males who are listening. Do you know what? Diversity does include you. So listen in to that TED Talk. And if you haven't done already as well, check out Tim's awesome 2 books that he has published, Crushing Your Dream Job and The Introvert's Guide to Job Hunting. But again, I'm going to put all of this into the show notes as well at the end of today's session, so you can check those out. So thank you very, very much, Tim.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
No worries at all. My name is Leila Mackenzie, and you've been listening to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.